welcome to IAS 2019 in studio. One of the biggest messages this week has been prevention. Everyone's talked about how important the prevention message has been and how important the message around choices has been. And of course, you can't have a conversation about prevention and not have a conversation about vaccines. And so this segment, we're going to talk about vaccines. Vaccines sometimes have been in the forefront. Sometimes the messages around vaccines have not been so loud. And so we have with us, at our last day of the conference, we have Linda Gale Becker, and we also have Florentine Badial. And they're going to talk to us about vaccines. So tell us, what do we need to know about vaccine that we learned this week in Mexico City?
So Phil, I would say the listeners should know they have to be excited. We're on an up phase of vaccines at the moment, and mostly that's because we have 3 efficacy trials, 3 trials looking to see whether the vaccine interventions they're doing would actually be effective in the long term, and a 4th vaccine trial about to start right here in this region.
So, as we talk about what I call the prevention portfolio, or the end the AIDS epidemic tactics or strategies. So we have the one strategy around marrying, PrEP and treatment as prevention, kind of the notion of biomedical prevention in that sense, and kind of creating what I call a functional cure. So that's one strategy. The other strategy is actual cure work, kind of saying someone is HIV infected today and tomorrow they're not. Using gene therapy and that theory. The third, of course, is vaccines. So given how the portfolio has changed over the years, or expanded, I should say, not really changed, but expanded over the years, why are vaccines still important?
Yes, actually, the HIV pandemic poses a real challenge when it comes to prevention, because not one single measure is going to solve the whole equation. We need a combination. So for certain populations, PrEP is perfect because it has a very high efficacy, and if someone is adherent to PrEP, it works very good. But in other populations, for certain people, a vaccine is absolutely necessary, so they can, be protected, if not 100%, at least as much as possible from being HIV infected.
So you raised the issue around being protected 100%, and so far, none of the compounds we have seen or we've tested have provided 100% efficacy. So what have we learned this week, or even before this week, if you will, around efficacy, and how efficacious must a vaccine be in order for it to be effective, particularly from a public health point of view?
So interestingly, we can turn to modeling for that, and because it's a hot topic. If I can take the listeners back to 2009, when the Thai study, the Thai vaccine trial results came out, there was about a 30% efficacy from that trial. And actually, the Thai government at the time decided that was not sufficient to roll that vaccine out. That was their decision to make. Now, modelers have gone back to say, let's look at that, and actually when you look at particularly high burden areas and you get enough scale, you get enough vaccine out to enough people, even a 30% efficacious vaccine would make a huge dent, say, to the epidemic that I have in my part of the world, which is Southern Africa. So I think this is a bit of a moving target. What I do know from participating in the conference this week is this is a conversation we need to start having with communities, because these trials are going to read out in 2021 probably, and we may have a slam dunk, we may have a partially effective vaccine, and we may have failure. We need to be talking to communities so they understand what that means. We're very excited after RV144, the Thai study, that at least we know we can vaccinate and protect people. So we're building on that success, and we're really hoping we'd have at least 50-60% efficacy this time in a couple of years' time.
So the Thai study gives us proof of concept.
Correct.
And I certainly understand how when we talk about vaccines, we talk about population control. But certainly in the world that I live in and work in, there's a second audience, and that's the individual control, And so if I'm a person, and you say to me, well, I have a vaccine, okay, and it's 30% efficacious, or basically we anticipate we're not going to have a complete failure. Maybe we'll have a home run and it'll be 100%, but probably it's going to be somewhere in the middle. Let's say 60%, 62%, something around that. If I am a person on an individual level making that decision, and you say to me, I have a vaccine and it's going to provide 62% efficacy, better than 30%, but I'm thinking 62%, that's not really ready for prime time. So unpack for me the difference between population control and individual protection. And for those of us who might be the ones who are going to be taking these vaccines, how does that impact our decisions?
Yes, actually, in the prevention of HIV, you have to be ready to offer a package of strategies to prevent HIV, both in the population and in the individual level. So you have to provide condoms, you have to provide education, you have to provide PrEP, and you have to provide a vaccine if it's efficacious. So, and let the options adapt to the needs and the reality of each person and of each population. And you also have to strengthen the health system. You have to fight stigma. You have to work towards human rights respect and towards targeting very vulnerable populations like adolescents and women and drug users, etc. And use harm reduction strategies. And it's really a package. And as long as an individual is ready to adhere to 1, 2, 3 of these strategies, then his protection will increase individually and also in the population level.
And in some ways, it feels like the lesson we learned around HIV treatment, that when we started HIV treatment, we were doing monotherapy. And then we discovered, and I'm old enough to remember the AZD days. I'm old enough to remember the pill boxes and the timers, right? Every 4 or 5 hours. But we learned that monotherapy did not work in the treatment of HIV.
Yep.
And so maybe the lesson is that monotherapy is not going to work in the prevention of HIV. And so just like in treatment, we attack the virus at different points at its life cycle. You would never prescribe monotherapy for the treatment of HIV. And so maybe if we think about that, it is really about the prevention cocktail, if you will.
Correct, Phil. And I think it's also about eras. So those bad old days, all we could offer were male condoms and education. They were miserable days. There were not a lot of choices for prevention. That, ABC, that's a miserable set of choices. We then are now in this era of partially protective, but a much better menu of things. We've got medical male circumcision, we've got oral PrEP, we've got all kinds of other PrEP coming down the line. That, and we may add to that a vaccine or an infusion that is preventive. We also know treatment as prevention is there. For partners on treatment, that helps in that whole layered protection sort of scenario. We keep hoping that there will be a time when we have a prophylactic vaccine, and that will truly help us move towards the eradication of this virus. In the meantime, all of these tools together, we really have a good shot at control of the epidemic. And that's very exciting as well, really getting those numbers down so the treatment pool starts to shrink. Because at the moment it's expanding, and that is kind of, financially unsustainable. So the big thing is to try and drive those numbers down, and that's good for the world.
Some of our guests have talked about the 2020 goals and how, we're probably not going to meet all the 2020 goals. And the one goal that apparently we've had the least amount of success is the new infection goal. And so that kind of speaks to the need for a vaccine, or quite frankly, the need for an expansion of the prevention portfolio. And so the vaccines potentially could make a huge impact on our ability to reach those goals in 2030.
There's one thing I can say to that is go big or go home.
That's right, exactly.
So, we have to get these tools that we've got out as much as we can, go to scale. In the cities where people have gone to scale, San Francisco, down in Australia. We're starting to see the mixture of treatment as prevention and PrEP is making all the difference. But the message to our listeners is until we have that vaccine, we're not going to be able to completely finish this epidemic off.
Now, Florentino, you mentioned the issue around stigma, and certainly social determinants of health are going to be critically important. Now, we're not going to actually solve this problem strictly from a biomedical point of view.
Exactly.
I know in my own health, I talk about my reality as a person living with HIV, and I talk about the fact that I take pills every day, and I look at those pills every day. And one of the things that I notice is that none of those pills has the ability to get into my body without my assistance. What the pills do is biomedical. What I do is behavioral. And so it seems to me that in order for us to find success, we're going to have to make a huge investment in awareness, in education, in dealing with the social determinants of health. And so as you folks focus on vaccine from a biomedical perspective, now, what are your concerns or thoughts or even strategies around addressing the social determinants and the behavioral issues that are going to make any vaccine effective?
Yes, thank you, Phil. Well, actually, community advisory boards are very important in protocols, so the participation of the community since the very beginning of the protocol, designing, planning is very important, because you can have a magnificent vaccine, but if the community is not, sensitized and ready for it, they will not take it. And we've seen that with the HPV vaccine. So we have to work with the communities. We have to be ready to listen to their needs. We have to obviously fight against stigma, discrimination. We have to erase the idea that if you need the vaccine, it's because you all are promiscuous or things like that. There's a lot of social stigma related to sexual issues. So we have to erase that, and we have to get close to the communities. And I wanted to make this example on the Mosaico trial. The Mosaico trial is going to start recruiting participants in Latin America, the United States and Europe, 3,800 participants. And the Mosaico trial is working a lot with the communities, and it's making clear that it's not only about the vaccine, it's working on, there's PrEP, there's condoms, there's post-exposure prophylaxis. I mean, if you are vaccinated and you have, an exposure, a high risk of acquiring HIV, you need post-exposure prophylaxis. It's not that you have the vaccine and you don't need it anymore. So this kind of things, you have to talk them with the community, and the community has to give you the feedback so that you get to work together.
This conversation is ongoing, and we're doing some vaccine trials now that's going to be reporting out in 2021. So, when you do these shows, sometimes they say, let's go to tape. And so let's do one of those things that maybe we can use in 2021. So when we're back together again at IAS 2021, and that's been a tongue twister for me all week. So what's going to be the vaccine story? So as we sit in Mexico City, what are you predicting that you're going to be saying to our audience in Berlin in 2021 about vaccines? What's the soundbite?
Well, there is no doubt, since I'm one of the protocol chairs of 702, that I'm hoping we have an efficacious vaccine. I don't think it's going to be that 100% yet. It's going to be, I'm hoping, over 50% so that we can really start to grapple with whether we want to roll it out, but it's not going to be perfect. We have to give 6 shots in order to reach that 60%. So what you're saying, Phil, behavior is still going to matter a great deal. So I'm hoping it's going to be that really positive readout for that one. And of course, Mosaico's sister, 705, will also be reading out. And so I don't know if you want to talk about what you're hoping for that one, Florentino.
For Mosaico.
Well, for 705, it's the sister study.
Yes, you're right. Yes, and I think that what as Linda is saying, we're not expecting a 100% effective vaccine in none of the trials, and it is important that we focus on certain populations, and the modeling studies are very important in taking decisions in whether it is worth all the effort in implementing the vaccine and the programs and doing all the outreach and the education, and it has to be And let us not just ask ourselves about the efficacy of the vaccine. We have to ask the question about, okay, it's the vaccine plus PrEP, plus education, plus stigma reduction, everything. So we have to do it in a package so that we can bring the success to its higher level. So the clinical success might be whatever, 30 or 60 hopefully, but we have to add to the clinical success or efficacy, we have to add all the extra prevention we get from the other measures. We have to make a real package.
I want to thank both of you for joining us today. Vaccines matter.
They do.
And they're an important part of our prevention package. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing on vaccines. And now we have you on tape. When we come back and when we meet again in Berlin at IAS 2021, we'll see if those predictions come to fruition.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Thanks, Phil.
If we've learned nothing, we've learned that we have the tools to end the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We have better surveillance tools. We know where the epidemic is. We have better diagnostic tools. We can find out who's infected and when and how long they've been infected. We have better treatment tools. The treatments we have today are simpler and easier and more effective than they've ever been before. We're developing some important policy tools as well. And most importantly, we have better prevention tools. But none of those tools actually matter if we don't understand them, as I've said throughout this week. If people don't have access to them and if people don't use it. So as we combine the biomedical and the behavioral, that's how we're going to get to the end of the AIDS epidemic. And so I want to thank you all again for joining us. Our next guest, we're going to turn our attention to AIDS 2020, and we're going to have with us Reverend Rob Newells, the co-chair of AIDS 2020, and Chris Beyer, who's also on the CCC for AIDS 2020, to talk about how we use the information from IAS 2019 to influence AIDS 2020 in the Bay Area of the United States. Rob and Chris, welcome to IAS 2019 in studio. We're so glad to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So both of you are involved in AIDS 2020, and so we'll start with you, Chris. So what has happened here this week that is going to inform kind of the things that you guys are trying to do when we get to the Bay Area next year?
Yeah. Well, I think there's been a lot of exciting new science, but there's also been some real challenging data presented. One study, very important study, is the outcomes of a big trial in several African countries that looked at contraceptive methods. And great news that this question we've been asking for many years about hormonal contraception and HIV risk is pretty clearly answered that it's not a risk. So that's great. The bad news is these are countries that have been doing a lot of work on 90-90-90 and a lot of treatment, and there still was very high rates of new infections. So this is a message about getting back to prevention. And I think 2020, we're going to see that we are not meeting the prevention targets that were set. And that is going to be a real accountability moment for our whole movement.
So Chris, as you mentioned, we might not make the 2020 goals. And so were there any presentations that happened this week that might inform the work that we can do between now and 2020 so that we're closer to those goals?
Yeah. I think one thing to say, Phil, is that the most important goal we're not going to meet is the reduction in new infections. That's where we're the farthest off. We're supposed to be down around 500,000 new infections worldwide in 2020. We're going to be well over 1 million, maybe even more. So what can we do? Really, it's a refocus on primary prevention. Not just treating everybody living with the virus, but on new prevention technologies. And there was a tremendous number of presentations here on new prevention tools and technologies. And also some advances on a tool we already have, PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, but going to on-demand PrEP, so that people who have more intermittent risks don't have to take it every day if they're not having risk exposures every day. And a great advance is that the World Health Organization during this conference put out their guidelines on on-demand PrEP, and that's going to open up this space for many countries to start using it. Now that regimen is really well validated for men who have sex with men, for gay and bisexual men. It is not recommended for women, and it is not currently recommended for transgender women who have sex with men. But it really is being recommended for men who have sex with men. And that's, of course, 2/3 of the new infections in the United States. So that's big.
And on that note, that is consistent with the information that we have with PrEP in general, that because of absorption issues with women, there's that PrEP is used in a different, is actually, the application of PrEP is different for women than for men, and we anticipate that's going to be true with PrEP on demand. But can you expand on the issue around transgender women? Is it still the absorption issue, or is it just that we don't have enough studies to tell us about PrEP on demand for transgender women?
So there are a number of studies in the field, and we're going to see some more data at 2020 that's going to help us really understand this. It looks like in the early studies there were major issues with adherence. And PrEP works for anybody, man, woman, trans, only works if you're really adherent to the regimen, and there was low adherence in some of the trials. It turns out that many trans women who use feminizing hormones have been very concerned about the impact of Truvada, the drug in PrEP, on hormones, and vice versa, hormonal impact on PrEP. So great data presented here. We now really, I think, clearly know that there is not an impact of Truvada on feminizing hormone levels. So if you are on feminizing hormones and you want to go on PrEP, it's not going to affect your hormonal levels. And that's a big issue.
Or vice versa.
Well, vice versa is a little different.
Okay.
There is an impact of exogenous hormone, feminizing hormones, on Truvada, but it's very modest. It's about a 15% reduction in blood levels with Truvada, but that doesn't take it below therapeutic levels. So we're coming out of IAS 2019 with a lot more confidence that this will work for transgender women if they want it and if they are willing and able to use it as recommended, as prescribed. The issue for women is different. It takes more doses of Truvada to reach a therapeutic level for women. It looks like for men, and what the WHO is saying, for men who have sex with men, that 2 doses is enough to get therapeutic. And that's why the on-demand regimen will work for men. And this is, something that I think people have not appreciated enough, is that Truvada is an oral drug. And almost all of the risk exposure for gay men is receptive anal sex. So this is an oral drug to protect the gut. And it's a great fit of risk to protection. And that's why it works so well for our community.
So on that note, Rob, let's turn our attention to AIDS 2020. The theme of the conference is resilience. And so talk to me about how you're going to deliver that message when we get to the Bay Area in July of 2020.
Well, resilience is really about how you respond, how you bounce back when you're hit with the challenge, right? And I think that AIDS 2020 in Oakland and San Francisco is going to give us an opportunity to look back on how resilient we've been over the years and remember our resilience for the challenges that we're facing today and that we'll be facing going forward. I think that Oakland and San Francisco have a good story to tell about being resilient in the face of oppression of different types, in the face of hostile political environments. And so I think that folks who come to Oakland and San Francisco will experience the resilience more than they'll see the word on the slogans, on the pictures and stuff. It's all of us have been resilient, and I think we're just going to tap into that resilience of all the participants.
So since you raise it and since you define resilience about bouncing back against challenges, the conference itself has faced some challenges, and there is a controversy on having the conference in the Bay Area at all. And so, as you prepare, and people are making that decision, why should people come to San Francisco and Oakland next year?
Well, I think what I've gotten from this meeting and some of what Chris has said about the information that's come out is about options and choice. And so people will have options next summer, and if they choose to come to Oakland and San Francisco, they will get an experience that we've never had at the International AIDS Conference before, right? This is the first time it's been in 2 cities. Nobody's ever done that with a major international conference. We are in Northern California at the heart of Silicon Valley, so we're going to use technology like it's never been used before at a conference. And I think, from my experience in attending other international AIDS conferences, I'm looking forward to welcoming people to my home. I was born and raised in Oakland, and so all the places that I've had the opportunity to visit, I'm ready to welcome everybody to Oakland to see what we've been doing, see what we've been dealing with, and see how we've overcome a lot of the challenges, some of it with San Francisco's help and some of it looking at San Francisco with a side eye. And San Francisco has done great work, but they're across the bay from me, and that seems like a really long way. I've tried to tell people San Francisco looks a lot like Europe and Asia, and Oakland looks a lot like Africa and Latin America. And so there'll be something for everybody at the International AIDS Conference next year.
In some ways, San Francisco and Oakland is a tale of two cities, and has been a tale of two cities. A lot of this conference, as we talk about the science, every guest has talked about key populations and vulnerable populations. And it seems to me that AIDS 2020 allows us to focus on vulnerable populations. And so what's going to happen at the conference to make sure that the conference is accessible to the most vulnerable among us, and particularly among those key populations that we all seem to be concerned about?
Sure. Well, I think aside from the scholarships that the International AIDS Society will be awarding, our local planning group is raising money for scholarships, not just for people from Oakland and San Francisco, but also from the Deep South in the United States and the other areas that have been identified in the End of the Epidemics Plan. So we're going to offer more scholarships, I think, than we've offered in the past. And I think that access, we're working behind the scenes a lot with State Department and Customs and Border Protection so that people who want to attend can attend. We're trying to remove as many barriers as possible ahead of time. And so I just encourage people to continue to check AIDS2020.org for the up-to-date information on travel. So there are real fears, but I think we have some real solutions that we're working on.
And I know that you've spoken about how to address access for those who need to come into the United States, but there are access questions for those of folks who live in the United States. The cost issue, concerns from Black folks and brown folks and other marginalized communities. What kinds of things are you going to put in place to make sure that AIDS 2020 is more welcoming to those folks?
I think those are the additional scholarships that our local planning group is raising funds for. We know that everybody can't get a scholarship from IAS. So we're doing our best to make sure that folks who traditionally have not had access, younger people, transgender men and women of color, and people in the Deep South and rural communities that may not have the backing to come to the conference, we're going to make sure that they get there. And of course, there are always volunteer opportunities to experience the conference as well.
And Chris, so talk to us a minute about the science that we're going to see in AIDS 2020. I know that you're very, very, very involved in IAS, and you've been the chair of this meeting before.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you learned a lot of lessons.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, of course, we now are in a very different place in the U.S. because we have the Ending the HIV Epidemic initiative. And that is bringing together the scientists, the federal government, both the CDC, the NIH, the Centers for AIDS Research are all getting supplements to start doing implementation science around getting control of our domestic epidemic. So that has, we hadn't planned that in advance, but that is now happening, and really the first outcomes of all that work are going to be presented at 2020. So I think that is just going to be enormous. Now, I'm an epidemiologist, so I will tell you that the science of understanding the epidemic has made tremendous advances, and people are going to see this. So I'll give you one example. If you look at the United States by county, there's 7,100 counties in the United States. It turns out that 48 counties, plus DC and San Juan, Puerto Rico, account for half of all new infections. So you look at that map, it's very specific where we have problems, where we have unaddressed issues. And it begins in East Texas and goes across the South and up through the Southeast to Baltimore, where I'm based. That is really the most affected area. And of course, as we know, it's not just geography. There is a huge racial and ethnic disparity and a huge disproportionate burden in African American communities in the South and the Southeast. That is the focus of the Ending the HIV Epidemic Initiative. And that science of how we're going to do that and how we're going to engage communities and do better to support folks in those hotspots, that's going to be a very big part of AIDS 2020. And we are going to make every effort to be sure that there is real representation from all of those 48 counties. That is going to be essential. And we're working with the Fed on that, and I'm very optimistic that that's going to happen. And this is something that we have learned from the international arena, the PEPFAR program, that has been funding care and treatment for doing such incredible work in Africa for so many years, has done this. They have done very careful mapping. They have figured out where transmission is happening, and they've put resources there. So this is something like a PEPFAR for the United States, and we've never done it. We've never committed to it. And now we're going to commit to it, and we're going to debate those plans, and we're going to, I think, really have a national conversation that's 25 years overdue.
Next up, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Kevin Osborne that's going to provide us with kind of a wrap-up of this IAS 2019 meeting and give us some ideas on what we have to look forward to as we move forward. So as we wrap up this week in Mexico City and the clock on IAS 2019 is winding down, who better give us an overview of what we've seen this week than the Executive Director of the International AIDS Society, Kevin Osborne. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Phil.
So tell me, are you happy? No, was this a good week for you?
It's been a good week, and I think it's been both a good week for the IAS and I think for the science community, because I think there were a lot of important mentions of things that are important in terms of HIV prevention, in terms of what we should be doing around treatment, and I think in terms of what we're doing about addressing some of the key structural barriers. So I think in that way it's really furthered the conversation.
Okay, so we've been asking everyone from where you sit. Now, what are the highlights of the week? So what are the three most important things that have come out of this meeting that make it worthwhile?
On a structural level, I'm going to say as the IAS, we're really proud that over half of the presenters that presented today or this week were women. Because I think we all talk about gender equality and making sure that there's space for women at the table. And in some ways, we did just that because we showed that the research that women are doing is really, really strong. And I think secondly, in terms of youth, nearly 40% of people that presented were under the age of 35. And I think if you just take those two things, they alone show that we're on a trajectory to try and address the new generation that should be leading the HIV response. So on a structural level, I'm really proud of that. On a scientific level, I think the issues around that came out around dolutegravir and the signal of what that means and how we can now be more clear in what has to happen around prevention, absolutely. And in terms of treatment, the idea of a two-drug regimen and what that looks like going forward, I think are things that we can look forward to.
So at the beginning of the week, I asked our guests, now at the end of the week, what will we know that we didn't know going into the week that will help us in the AIDS epidemic? So now we're at the end of the week, right? So what should we know that we didn't know going into this week?
We know that dolutegravir is safe and efficacious, and we should be using that.
Okay.
We know that there needs to be a lot more conversations around involving communities in issues that affect their lives. And we know that there's a lot of space around the new treatment regimens that are going to make a change in people's lives for tomorrow. And what that means in terms of, for example, on implants. I think there's a whole generation of choice that's going to be available to people.
And so you just used that magic word, it's choice. So kind of the theme of this conference has been about choice. You know? And so can you give me 2 or 3 examples of the choices that have been affirmed this week that now when the rubber hits the road, when the science hits the streets, people are going to have more choices in these areas. What would those areas be?
I would say, broadly speaking, it's around prevention. I think people will be able to make better prevention choices. Even though I think the suite of prevention choices is growing, we still need to do a lot more about keeping prevention on the agenda in a very holistic way. I think there's a lot more choices going to be happening around how we do things in terms of implementation. So where should those choices be made for populations? How do we integrate it within sexual and reproductive health programs? How do we integrate it within comorbidity programs? So I think the choices of how we do things is as important as what we do.
Now, I think all of our guests have said it's been important for this meeting to be here in Mexico City, you know, to focus on Latin America. And if that's true, then the fundamental question has been, now that we've done this meeting here, how can we make sure that the science that came out of this meeting is relevant on the streets, in communities, in Mexico and across Latin America? And so what are your thoughts about that?
I think it's an important question about the value of conferences in terms of making sure that the policymakers who actually make the difference in many people's lives are actually hearing things. So I think the fact that you've seen within the Mexican government, for example, and in Latin America, the focus of the conference being here has galvanized a lot of ideas around what they could be doing better in terms of, for example, where some of the gaps are around, example, PrEP. So I think it's an important conversation starter to show that other places in the world are doing things, and how can this region in some ways do more.
You know, I have been attending IAS conferences for the last 22 years. I have not missed one in the last 22 years, particularly the AIDS conference. I may have missed some of the IAS meetings. And one of the things that I would always write at the end of the week was this. We have been here for a week. We have spent an ungodly amount of money to do this meeting. Now, was it worth it? And so as the executive director of the International AIDS Societies, I have to put that question to you. This is not a cheap proposition. You know, next year in the Bay Area is not going to be a cheap proposition. Now, in 2021 in Berlin is not going to be a cheap proposition. So thinking about the accomplishments of this meeting, you know, was it worth it and why?
Absolutely. I think nothing can replace conversations. So we often say that the networking that has to happen, which often seems as intangible, but if you see those conversations that happen outside in the hallways, or people getting that aha moment because they're actually interacting with a researcher who's done that research, and that then leads to the change at a policy level or at a community level. I think those aha moments of where people go, that's really important, or I've learned something new, or I've experienced something different, and I'm going to take that home. That, in some ways, that intangible quality makes it absolutely worthwhile.
So my last question is, you've been the head of IAS for about a year now. So, and I know that IAS, you know, as most organizations should be, is going through all sorts of transition to prepare for the future. You know, if you don't adapt, you're going to become obsolete. So what are some of the changes that are happening within IAS structurally or programmatically that we can look forward to as we look towards AIDS 2020 and as we look for IAS 2021?
I think two things, Phil. One is the role of conferences. You've sort of hinted at it, to say what's the value of them. And the IAS is, in terms of the International AIDS Conference, we've just started a review to try and understand how should we change, if anything, about how the International AIDS Conference is run, what should its focus be, is there that value for money proposition that you spoke about? So that's going to be a report that we've just commissioned to be done, and we're asking lots of people to contribute to that so that we can start better understanding and set ourselves up to be fitter for the future, so that in time to come, as conferences shift and change, as the world is changing around global health and the architecture around HIV is mercurial and it's changing in front of our eyes, the IAS can be proactive in providing a response. So not having a cookie cutter mentality around how we approach conferences, but really being forward looking and saying, if there's an importance around networking, around community engagement, how do we do that in a new era? So absolutely, that would be one. And I think secondly, it's a way, how do we engage people? So at the IAS, we're also looking at ways to engage at our governance board. We're trying to look at ways to engage communities and engage people in our governance and in our structures. And then the third one is around our programs. While the IAS does a lot of work around conferences, we've got a whole suite of programs that we try and respond to. Some around key populations, some around towards an HIV cure, and our latest work is around vaccines. So how do we make sure that as a neutral convener, we can play an additive value? So I think there's a lot of work that's also being done in our programmatic portfolio.
Well, that's all very exciting, and we look forward to hearing a lot more about what's going on inside IAS and how IAS is impacting all of our goals, our common desire to end the AIDS epidemic. I want to thank you for taking the time to spend with us today, and we're going to be looking to see what's coming up in the future.
Thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you. Coming up next, we're going to wrap up this week with a conversation with the co-chair of IAS 2021. So what better way to end this remarkable week than to have a conversation with the co-chair of the 2021 IAS conference. We have with us Hendrik Streek, who is going to be the co-chair of IAS 2021. And so as we look and review this week, what have you learned this week that's going to help you do a great job when we get to Berlin in 2021?
So I think this IAS meeting was really exciting for prevention. And so one thing that really was exciting for me was to see the data of the phase 1 trial on the MK8591 implant. Having something like this that can really prevent HIV infection for a year or so. We have to wait for the phase 2 and 3 data, but having something that could prevent HIV infection for such a long period without any changes, not thinking about pills, not thinking about behavior, that's a game changer. That's a game changer worldwide and might really make a dent into the epidemic.
And by 2021, we should have some information from those studies on the implant.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of history around Berlin and HIV and AIDS and the international conference. The last time the AIDS conference was in Berlin was in 1993. I was there. It was not a happy time.
No, it wasn't.
So do we have promises that 2021 is going to be a happier time?
Well, you have to put it a little bit in perspective, because in 1993, that was just 4 years after the wall came down. So in Berlin, everybody was celebrating their freedom, but at the same time, you had the sense of despair because AZT monotherapy didn't work. You had this toxic drugs that were coming on the market, but since then, Berlin has really changed, and it became a city of freedom, a city of hope. It's a city of diversity and freedom, including sexual freedom. And the people in Berlin really fought hard for this. And I think this also represents now what the IAS 2021 will be. It will be a meeting where we are celebrating freedom, where there's no place for stigma and discrimination, and where we will look at these new data from the vaccine efficacy trial, from the implants, where we will look at this data and will hopefully have some really exciting findings that can be presented then.
And Berlin also will forever be connected to the proof of concept of a cure. Now, we're 13 years away from the Berlin patient. Earlier this year, we now have a London patient, so we have 2 patients with proof of concept. It appears there's a 3rd person out there as well. And so in 2021, what do you think we're going to be talking about in the area of cure?
Well, I think it is important to see that we are taking steps, but it's always baby steps. We have to be careful that we are not celebrating too early any huge successes and put it out in the media that people just think HIV is curable. But going from Berlin, the Berlin patient 12 years ago or so, then to the London patient, then the Düsseldorf patient, we are taking baby steps, but we are more and more getting there to crack the code, what it means on how we can achieve long-term remission. So I think by then we will have evidence whether the Düsseldorf patient, the 3rd patient may have worked. And we probably will have many more of those patients that might have worked or not worked. And we will better understand what might be a pathway to go to actually get in the direction of long-term remission or even cure.
And as we kind of wrap up IAS 2019 and we look forward to AIDS 2020 and IAS 2021, what do you see as some of the biggest gaps and challenges that we need to focus on to talk about in 2020 and then to talk about in 2021?
Well, I think one important fact is that we cannot deny is that we still have 1.7 million new infections each year. This just means if we are not doing more in the arena of prevention and really reducing the number of new infections each year, we will just chase our tails and we will not be able to actually, whatever funding we put behind it, to treat everyone worldwide. So we have to look towards prevention, but at the same time we cannot ignore all the diseases and infections that happen surrounding prevention. So all the other sexually transmitted infections, there are barely any discussions on that, and there has not been a lot of focus in terms of research on this. But for example, gonorrhea is spiking right now. Syphilis in Germany is really high. But in particular, infections like gonorrhea, we are starting to develop antibiotic resistance, and there has been calls out that there might be even superbug status by 2020. So if we are not focusing on those infections at the same time and really trying to have a global prevention on sexually transmitted infections, we will maybe find a way to fight one epidemic, but we will have another epidemic on our hands.
Exactly. When we think about, what has happened in Berlin and all the changes that have happened there, and we think about looking forward around HIV and AIDS, and you raised the issue around we're seeing resistance against drug-resistant gonorrhea and syphilis. Yesterday we spoke about resistance even in the HIV space. Obviously comorbidities and co-infections are important issues as well. And so in 2021, now have you set already kind of the themes and the feelings around what are going to be the big topics in 2021?
Well, I hope one big topic will be really prevention, preventing new HIV infections, because we will hopefully have the results of the Imbokodo trial,
right,
like the phase 2b vaccine trial, that in my perspective is extremely promising. And hopefully we'll get new results on other prevention methods like the implants or injectables, or even the M studies like the broadly neutralizing antibodies. These are all studies that are coming out in the next 2 years, and I think we can make a real good focus on looking at prevention methods and comparing them to each other and see what is the best strategy to fight this epidemic globally.
And as we wrap up, 2021 is also the 40th anniversary of the MMWR that really kind of put HIV on the map. And so what kind of pressure are you feeling about co-hosting IAS 2021, the year that we're going to be commemorating the 40th anniversary of the epidemic?
Well, it is a sad anniversary, and I hope that Berlin will be associated with the first day of actually ending the AIDS epidemic, and that we have a hard look on our progress, and that we find maybe a breakthrough to actually put an end to this, that we don't have another 10 years to celebrate as an anniversary, but that we have a 40th anniversary and will be the last day and the last anniversary of this epidemic.
Well, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to spend some time with us, to giving our audience kind of a preview of what to look forward to in 2021. I hope that we're going to continue this conversation. I hope that we have a chance to talk in 2020 and again in 2021 at the beginning of the conference, and kind of walk through that conference as well.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us this week. Again, we've had some amazing conversations, and the conversation has to continue. Now, that is the way that we are going to end the AIDS epidemic. We have to continue our fight on the medical front, in clinical areas, but we also have to continue to fight on the community level. It all begins by continuing the conversation. We're going to continue the conversation. You can continue the conversation. Now, please stay with us on the website, IAS 2021. We look forward to talking to you at AIDS 2020 and continuing this dialogue, and maybe absolutely talking about the opening to the end of the AIDS epidemic, and that will be the demarcation and the legacy of the Berlin Conference.